I've been promised that if I say good morning NJPN, you're going to react well. So we'll try this. Ready? Good morning NJPN.
Good morning.
All right. Fantastic. Cool. That. Excellent.
Try that one more time.
Yeah, yes. This
That was great.
Let's do it. Yeah. Good morning NJPN. That's good. Shall we,
Let's hope we still do that at the end. Yes.
So I thought we might. Oh, I'm sorry. Ellen said I must introduce myself. So my name's James. I work for the Columbans. I live in Birmingham. What else do I need? That'll do, right? I thought we'd introduce ourselves slightly differently this morning. We're going to play a game of true or false. So I need you all to find a way of showing me true. So can you make a T with your arms or your bodies or... That's very good. Excellent. That's good. Little T. I like that. That's good. Excellent. And you could also shout the word true, maybe. True. That's good. Excellent. And then we need a word for false. A thing for false. This is a harder one. Something that looks a bit like, oh, that's nice. But that almost feels like you're booing, Chrissy. But we'll go with that anyway. All right. So I like that. That's good. We've got some F's appearing. Excellent. Good. Right. So we start like this. And the first one we thought we'd get the really important things done. Christine is a big fan of celery. True or false? False. So I need to see some signs and hear some noise. Is it true or false? You can tell I do use the word normally, can't you? Yeah. And is that true or false?
It's false. Celery is the devil's toenails.
The devil's toenails. She said that so passionately last night. Right. Okay, Christine has worked for Progressio, Christian Aid and CAFOD, where she is currently serving as Executive Director. That's true. But true or false? Yeah. Her career began... Actually, I heard someone say to her this morning, didn't you work for CAFOD? Which I thought was quite nice. Did you used to work for CAFOD?
Well, I did used to work for CAFOD as well.
But true or false, her career began as a diocesan justice and peace field worker. Do you remember that? Yes, and that was in the booklet. So if you didn't know the answer to that, it means you haven't looked in the booklet yet. Alright, now it gets more fun. Alright, in the 90s, Christine worked with the Columbans and was instrumental in the controversial decision to end the always popular Columban calendar swimsuit edition. True or false? You are correct, it is false. She did work for the Columbans, but we have never used Columbans posing in little mankinis to raise money for mission.
Yet.
Should we consider it now? Yes. Welcome back, Ed O'Connell. Oh, he agreed he would stand up and pose, but he didn't. Here we go. Welcome back, Ed O'Connell.
Right. Which month should you be?
Tammy, I need you to prepare the visual aid. Right. It says here, Christine is inspired by CST. But true or false, this stands for cheese sampling and tasting. So, bring me there we go. True or false, CST, cheese sampling and tasting. The cheese will be available in the bar tonight. Yeah. It is false, it is false. Well done. But Catholic social teaching then. Catholic social teaching, often known as the church's best. Just put it by Christine, that'd be ideal. There you go. That's very good. Okay, there you go. True or false? No, we've done that bit. How did you first discover Catholic social teaching?
I think part of it was CAFOD. But also I was involved, my main sort of formation, if you like, was through something called the Young Christian Students. So it's one of the Cardine movements, the YCW as well. And after I'd left school, I worked for YCS, and one of the things that I had was we were hosting a European meeting, and I had all these people who were from different parts of the world or different parts of Europe who were talking about all these things, subsidiarity and all this, that and the other, and I was like, what's all that? And then they said, this is Catholic social teaching, and I was completely blown away by this kind of, the pedagogy of the oppressed, that's paraphrase as well, but all of this stuff. So yeah, I was kind of this, bright-eyed 18-year-old who kind of went, what? The church is talking about this? So yeah, it's fascinating.
Thank you. Right, this is the hardest one, I think. Given her role at Cathod, her personal commitment to Catholic social teaching, and it says here, ending the injustices of poverty, inequality and environmental exploitation. Although I need to say that she was in the queue for the cake last night in front of me with 2 plates, and there were 2 bits of cake there. And I didn't get it. But anyway, it says there that she does these things. I think she took one for someone else. It's all right. Yeah? She shared it. No, you shouldn't. True or false, Christine leads her parish Catholic group.
False.
Come on, let's see some serious voting here. Some of you stop moving hands. Most of them think false. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, that's
my face.
So, true or false, Christine?
It is actually false. I think it's quite appropriate for other people to do things. I did quite a lot. At my parish, I do a few bits of music in my parish.
Yeah, you lead the children's choir. Yeah. So I thought that was a nice little question there about kind of, well, how do you balance the personal and the professional in this vocation? It must be a vocation being chief executive, or was it executive director of Catholic?
Yeah, something like that. It is. I think it's also. I guess one of the things that I would say is that I do often do things in Catholic in my parish, but I think it's also a lesson for all of us that we can't do everything. You know? And also when we are, if we're serious about subsidiarity or serious about kind of working in collaboration, sometimes it's important to step back and enable and empower other people to do things. And I know apparently I'm a bit of a personality, so it's easy to kind of push other people out of the way, and so it's important to not do everything. But yeah, there's a fair amount of sort of guilt and feeling that actually we should be doing more all the time, don't we? But we just have to balance that. So if you've got, it's a constant balancing act, really, in terms of family commitments and also looking after yourself. But that lovely phrase, which is kind of like a bit of a personal manifesto, which is the reading from Micah, act justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with your God. It's also that sense of kind of looking after yourself is part of that relationship, our relationship with one another, with the earth, with the community, and our individual relationship with God. And yeah, there's times when God gives me a kicking, but there's also an awful lot of time when God says, just chill out, Kelly, you're all right, And I'm not here to save the world, that's kind of been done.
Yeah, I think a lot of us could relate to that, kind of finding that balance is a challenge. All of that was in replacement of me reading out her biography. So we now start. We kind of, when we met to plan...
Honestly, this is planned.
Yeah. it sort of evolved. So what you're going to hear is sort of scripted and sort of not, and we'll kind of change as we go along. And we've sort of phrased it as it's a conversation reflecting on Cathod's ongoing journey, discerning response to Laudato Si, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Cry of the Earth, the Cry of the Poor. We're trying to draw out learning that might be coming from Cathod, that might be useful for others, us as individuals, us as a movement. I think that's the journey we're hoping to go on over the next roughly an hour. And towards the end, we'll move to a time where we kind of throw it back to everyone out there and say, well, all right, well, what are you taking away from this? And ask for feedback on that. So that's the plan. Now watch us go off plan. So the first question we had, we'll start on the script, so that it's easier when we go off. The world seems pretty depressing at the moment. Can we be confident that something like the SDGs can offer us hope?
Well, Brian talked last night, didn't he, about the importance of hope, and sometimes it can feel very challenging to have that hope, because as a world we are failing. Our world leaders are, rather than leaving no one behind, they're leaving the promises behind. And as Brian talked last night, as a world, we're really not on target in terms of those SDGs. But he also reminded us of that amazing year of 2015, and the fact that we had not just the SDGs, and we had the Paris COP, and we also had Laudato Si. And I remember in 2015, I was at a meeting in the run-up to the preparations for the Paris COP, meeting with Al Gore, which was quite an experience, and he was an amazing kind of speaker. And he has 3 questions, and it's about addressing climate change, but I think it applies to most things. And he was like saying, the first question is, should we? When we're thinking about any kind of change, should we? This is that moral imperative, or that burning platform, you know. And then the second question is, well, can we? Do we have the technical ability? Do we have the resources? You know, are we just simply able to make those changes? And the third question, which is the absolute knocker out of the park, is the will we? This is the political will, this is the desire, and this is the ability to sort of put the challenges and the changes and the theory into practice. And I think as a world, we're very clear, we've got that clarity that, yes, we should, you know, and there's people, so many people, what I've seen over the last 8 years, and in fact throughout my life, huge numbers of people saying, yes, we absolutely should, many of which in this room. And yes, we can. We have got the technical knowledge, we have got the global resources, but what we're lacking is that political will. And I think that's one of the issues for us, is how do we translate that? So, I mean, I have to say, personally speaking, I think there's hope in the fact that we do have a framework like the SDGs. I don't have a huge amount of there's a lot of resources that's gone into the SDGs. You just look them up on the UN website. There's been UN process. I'm not sure that I have huge amounts of confidence in that process. I think a lot of my confidence and my hope lies in the people and the communities that we work with, the work on the ground, people like yourselves, and as CAFOD, you know, the work that we do, the people that we're with, the church, as particularly as part of the global Caritas network, as we're trying to put that commitment and that solidarity into practice. And leave no one behind, that's that phrase within the SDG framework. And it's deeply theological of looking out, you know, the lost sheep, the fact that the Good Samaritan stopped. All those sorts of things are really critical for us in terms of leaving no one behind. So I think my hope doesn't come out of necessarily those processes, but it comes out of the people and the interactions in the communities and the thinking and the planning that we're all doing.
You've kind of started in this thing already, but, and I suppose Brian covered it a lot last night, but if you could just build a little bit on the link between Catholic social teaching and the SDGs, just explore that a little bit.
Yes, I think it's a conceptual link rather than necessarily saying the SDGs themselves come out of Catholic social teaching. But I think, you know, as Brian said last night, you know, Laudato Si reminds us about the importance of the interconnectedness of issues. So the 17 SDGs, but they're not, and they've got their own action plans, they've got their own targets. And like with anything, when you've got something as big as tackling global inequality, you've kind of got to, you know, how do you eat an elephant? You kind of have to slice it up. So apologies to the vegetarians.
That's not NJPN policy. There will be no elephants out there.
No elephant slicing today. But you know, we've got to be able to have plans. You've got to be able. You can't just deal with things in a very vague kind of top line way. But nonetheless, Laudato Si reminds us that, you know, we're all interconnected. And for CAFOD, the context of that, or the concept that we use is from Laudato Si, called integral ecology, that sense of interconnectedness. And that therefore that we're called to recognise and act on that deep interconnectedness between people, between the environment, between economics and politics, between our daily lives and our wider cultures, you know, all sorts of levels. And that requires us to do that level of analysis. It doesn't require us, as we were saying before, to do everything on everything, because we simply can't. But to do the analysis and understand how these things fit together enables us to be able to say, well, okay, from my sphere of influence or my organisation's sphere of influence, the skills that we've got, what can we focus in on? What do we bring? What's the kind of contribution that we put on the table? But also, what are some of the challenges? I mean, integral ecology also says that, well, we've got to recognise that if we're interconnected, then there's a responsibility. And one of my challenges for the SDGs is that it's still very much around a kind of positive, not aggressive, but it's still a growth paradigm. It doesn't say, actually, some of you have to use the resources less, or use less resources. And we, I think Catholic social teaching takes it that bit further to talk about structural injustice. You know, in our context, we probably talk about colonial past, we need to talk about reparations, we need to talk about the fact that some people are rich because some people are poor. And that's a really important dynamic to recognise. And if we need everybody to flourish, we kind of have to recognise that those injustices, that structural sin, is embedded in our economics, in our paradigm, in the way in which we see the world. And therefore you do have to rethink that. And I'm not taking an anti-growth perspective here, because I think there is an issue about what sort of growth. There's green growth, there's a way in which all need to flourish. But we all know, because we've all experienced it, we experience it in this country as well as globally, that whole mantra that, you know, all boats rise isn't true. Some boats rise damn sight faster than others, and some boats have been well sunk in the process. So it's about recognising those injustices and inequalities that exist, and that's kind of what we're trying to do.
I think there's something from kind of earlier Catholic theology, I suppose, before I to see words like oppressor and oppressed and exploitation, and maybe some of the analysis that we might see, for example, in the Just Fair from Global Justice Now, that's got more teeth than the SDGs. Yeah, they're almost a little bit sanitised.
I mean, they are to some extent, because that's the nature of they're working at a big political process. I mean, I know from UN climate change negotiations that, you know, you'd have arguments about you'd have an argument. I mean, the big argument in 2015 was the at least, you know, that it was at least 2 degrees, because that was the only way that you'd get 1.5 onto the agenda. And now 1.5 is the agenda, so that's good. So you know, there's something about recognising that the UN and SDG processes are, yes, they're ambitious and aspirational in that vision, but they're not talking about necessarily the way in which we get there. One of the good things about the SDGs, so I don't want to sound like this is a big complete negative on the SDGs, Brian, I'm sorry, and it's very different. So the Millennium Development Goals, as Brian talked last night, that was what were the rich countries took on board. The Millennium Development Goals were, we as rich countries, we're going to decide how much we spend on what, and we're going to have those targets and we do them. The big difference then to the SDGs was the fact that it was civil society and it was the voices of countries from the south saying, no, we don't want you to stitch us up anymore, we want to be more collaborative on this. This has got to be not just about what the rich say to us, but it's also about what we say about ourselves. So the universality of the SDGs is a really important shift in us having, as rich countries, having a bit of humility. But there are always going to be political processes, and because of that, there's always going to be a level of well, what works, what's acceptable. You know, to get 195 countries even sign, or 193 signing it, that's a laugh in itself. Ask Brian about the other two. But you know, the point is that to be able to get them signing up, it's got to be sort of acceptable, and it's got to fit it's got to be bought into, and that's not always, you know, a very strong social justice kind of perspective is not necessarily going to be always easily accepted by the politicians. And that's why, you know, people and communities are so important in kind of holding politicians to account, because, you know, the SDGs as a vision is absolutely fantastic. What we've not got strongly enough is that roadmap in terms of how we get there, and that's why at a local level or at a national level, the lobbying and the working with national governments is really important to say, actually, you've signed up to this, so we're going to hold you to account because we need to get there. So the value of having that framework is huge, really huge. So please don't hear me, dissing the SDGs. But it's a massive responsibility to all of us to be able to say to our government, we're not delivering it. But actually there are different ways in which those goals can be delivered. Are they delivered in a way that's sustainable, properly, that recognises the structural injustices in our world, or are they kind of, here's a blank cheque for businesses to do things differently?
Play with that idea of businesses a bit more then. So businesses, corporations set up to make profit, how do they fit within that model of the SDGs?
Well, they fit quite a lot actually, and it's interesting. I was really struck by Brian's slide last night that showed that the one that's green is the business one, and there's an in the UK. Yeah. There's an awful lot of businesses actually that are really taking sustainability seriously. I mean, they're, especially at the moment, there's a huge number of businesses in the private sector that are actually leaving this government behind, and they're really frustrated at the lack of a political coherent policy roadmap in terms of getting there. There are always going to be some that for whom they're making money out of fossil fuels or unsustainable ways of doing things. They're going to hold on to the last possible minute. But business and private sector isn't in and of itself a bad thing. And I think what we also are seeing is a lot of movement around different forms of social enterprise, different forms of businesses that can really do things in a much better way. Businesses are much more clocked on to the fact that people care about sustainability, people care about human rights. There's a lot more what's called environmental and social governance, ESG, kind of considerations that are made by consumers, and consumer power is in some respects greater now than it ever was. We were it's like what Anne was saying last night about the fact that, we remember when we were all battling to get something like a fair trade logo, and now, you walk down the aisle of a supermarket and it's there. So, that's become much more part of our mainstream, which is great. So I think there is that potential there to be able to work with businesses. There are a lot of good people out there who want to try and kind of push that, and the use of businesses or the private sector to be able to push the government more. I think is, especially this one, that doesn't seem to listen to people, bless you, but doesn't seem to listen to people like us, but who will listen to business, I think is also really important.
We'll move from an analysis of or discussion of the SDGs a bit towards CAFOD now.
Yeah, but actually I wanted to, you were going to ask me about the SDGs, I remember now.
We missed it on
we missed it.
Yeah,
That's fine. No, because we were going to
this is well practice.
It's really practice. We were going to talk about integral ecology, weren't we? Because, and I did, and then I forgot that the best people to explain what. That's right, I know. Yeah, I'm trying to work into it to make it look like I'm planning it. So the best thing, one of the things that CAFOD wants to try and do is to make sure that it amplifies the voice and agency and leadership of our partners overseas. And one of our partners, Caritas Brasileira, are going to share their reflections on integral ecology, what that concept means. It's in Portuguese, but it's got the subtitles. So if you need to move a bit nearer to be able to see a screen, please go. So can you run the video, please?
Esse conceito que foi introduzido aí pelo Papa Francisco durante a encíclica Laudato Si, que é a ecologia integral, representa muito para nós, assim, na atuação do nosso trabalho, né? Na compreensão de como a gente vê esses desafios ambientais dentro do nosso trabalho em emergência, porque a gente compreende que a emergência, ela não acontece do nada e não vem por si só. Existem fatores pré-determinantes, né? E muitos deles são fatores ambientais que a gente tem que sempre levar em consideração. Então, essa forma de ver a ecologia de uma forma integral mesmo, né? Interconectada. Então, uma crise, uma emergência, ela sempre sempre vai estar conectada com desigualdades sociais, com outros aspectos e aspectos ambientais também, né, que a gente deve sempre considerar aí no nosso trabalho de resposta, né? A gente não gosta de visualizar uma emergência de forma separada, a gente tenta sempre conectar com fatores pré-determinantes e também com fatores sociais, culturais. É fundamental para a gente responder isso de uma forma que acolha não só aquela realidade emergencial, mas a realidade que já vinha pré-estabelecida antes da emergência, né? Então a gente busca não se ater só às necessidades imediatas e emergenciais, mas também a questões de sustentabilidade a longo e médio prazo das comunidades que a gente busca auxiliar aí nesse âmbito emergencial.
Anteriormente, ela foi fundada em 1956 pelo Dom Helder Câmara, e tal como as outras Caritas pelo mundo, ela surgiu de um contexto emergencial. Então, não dá para separar a Caritas brasileira da sua atuação com emergências. A gente fala que está no coração da nossa Caritas, atuar com emergências. Mas ao longo de todos esses anos, né, veja, ela foi fundada em 1956, mas ao longo de todos esses anos, e sempre em diálogo com os movimentos progressistas da igreja e também com as discussões aqui no Brasil, na América Latina e discussões internacionais sobre as mudanças climáticas, sobre a convivência com os biomas, no tema das mudanças climáticas, sobre mitigação e adaptação às mudanças climáticas, todo o tema aí, por exemplo, dos direitos da natureza, dos rios, das florestas, dos bosques, das matas. A Caritas, ela foi historicamente se aproximando de todas essas discussões. Então, a ecologia integral, a gente também poderia dizer que ela faz parte do coração da Caritas brasileira.
O grito dos pobres, e eu acho que dialoga muito também com a questão da ecologia integral, né? A Caritas brasileira, de forma mais ampla, busca combater assim, a pobreza, a injustiça social, ao mesmo tempo em que protege, né, o meio ambiente e também responde às emergências. Então, na verdade aquele conceito de não deixar ninguém para trás, né? A gente, embora se coloque aí em uma situação diferente, emergencial, existe ali uma situação que não pode ser, digamos assim, a gente não pode se esquecer da situação social, né? E das injustiças sociais, e por isso a Caritas trabalha muito também na questão da incidência política, para que não só se responda uma emergência, mas que também se possa ajudar essas famílias, né, em situação de vulnerabilidade social, econômica, incentivando que elas de fato sejam autossuficientes, até mesmo para que essa situação de emergência, por exemplo, não se torne recorrente aí. Então, um exemplo muito bom que a gente pode citar e que é uma boa prática, que a gente inclusive tem desenvolvido com o apoio da CAFOD, é promover práticas agrícolas sustentáveis, né? Então, o projeto emergente no Piauí, ele busca conservar fortalecer de fato as comunidades vulnerabilizadas, ao mesmo tempo que dá recursos para que essas pessoas possam continuar aí, né? E daí reverter essa situação, essa injustiça social, essa pobreza, que muitas vezes é acentuada pela situação de emergência, mas que já existia e que, se não for abordada de uma maneira interconectada, é muito provável que vá se continuar com essa vulnerabilidade. Então, a proteção ao meio ambiente e também prover uma subsistência a longo prazo para essas comunidades é muito importante para o nosso trabalho enquanto Caritas.
Essa questão dos gritos, eu vejo que ela dialoga com a nossa missão enquanto Caritas brasileira. É um tipo de autoquestionamento que a gente tem constantemente quando a gente trabalha com emergências, por exemplo. As organizações aqui no Brasil, por exemplo, que atuam em emergências, quem delas, o governo, por exemplo, né, quem delas olha para a pessoa que sofreu aquela situação de emergência, aquele desastre e tal, mas para aquela pessoa que sai da sua casa e agora está debaixo da ponte. São esses questionamentos que a gente tem, né, de acolhimento dessas pessoas super vulnerabilizadas, mais do que qualquer tipo de fazer uma ação estrondosa, né, que tenha muita visibilidade. Acho que a gente tem o nosso maior compromisso nisso, de se questionar quem são as pessoas, de fato, que estão precisando de um apoio, quem está debaixo da ponte, e como a terra, também integrando o grito da terra, né? Quais são os gritos da terra? Por exemplo, é dessa perspectiva que a Caritas brasileira tem se aproximado muito das discussões sobre os direitos da natureza, através de incidência política e tudo mais. Por exemplo, a gente vê muitas ações sendo executadas no contexto do Rio São Francisco, de apoio, né, de fato, enfim, até na perspectiva do semiárido, mas quem se questiona sobre os gritos e as dores do Rio São Francisco? A gente tem avançado nesse sentido de se questionar os direitos do Rio São Francisco. Né, com tantas modificações que a humanidade faz na natureza, a terra também grita. Então, nessa perspectiva que a gente avança, sobretudo, na defesa da natureza, de uma forma geral, né, e isso nunca dissociado da defesa das populações tradicionais, das populações indígenas. Caritas brasileira é trabalhar com populações tradicionais, populações indígenas, a gente chama os guardiões da floresta, os guardiões dos rios, das matas. Eu vejo que essa é a proposta integrativa que a Caritas tem com os gritos, né? Os gritos das pessoas, que os povos tradicionais e originários, que menos contribuem para o avanço das mudanças climáticas, mas infelizmente a gente sabe que mais são atingidos por elas. Então, o nosso foco é muito direcionado nas pessoas em situação de vulnerabilidade social que gritam, e para a terra também, que também grita.
Great. So, I think Lucas and Tanoa really explained that really well. So that integral ecology concept of not doing everything, but of understanding the different factors that are playing out, and hopefully there's some resonance from what they've said in terms of your different aspects of work throughout.
So let's continue exploring CAFOD then. So you've got a new strategy in place, I believe inspired by Laudato Si. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, so we spent a few years reflecting on Laudato Si as an organisation, staff with partners, with some volunteers as well, and that then fed into articulating our common strategy, which is called Our Common Home. Nice again. And first of all, it's very much about how it's enshrined in Laudato Si, and hearing the calls and the challenges that Pope Francis throws down to us all. And as you flagged, James, Laudato Si, Catholic social teaching, grows and evolves. So it's never just one document. You know, you read Laudato Si, you read, Popular Progressio, you read the Magentives. There's all sorts of documents in there from the whole rich tradition. It builds all the time. And of course, it's because it's rooted in Scripture. So developing our new strategy to say, right, okay, moving forward, we've got 4 key planks. The first plank is that integral ecology, so that we take that approach and we try to do that to have the biggest impact for people and communities who are the most vulnerable. And I think that really expands that really, really well. And that's also both in terms of how we respond immediately, but also how do we ask ourselves the questions about where we speak out, how we tackle the causes of poverty. And I mean, Lucas, reminded us there that Caritas Brasileira was founded by Dom Helder Camara. And you don't need reminding, but I'm going to remind you of his famous quote, which is, when he was Archbishop of Recife, and he said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." So for those of you who have not heard that before, I'm going to say it again because it's so brilliant. When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. And the context of Brazil and structural realities there, I think it's the same across the world. And that sense of we also have to ask why, and we also have to address why. And I think that's the door opening that models like the SDGs offers, because the SDGs is a little bit in the first category. Yes, we want to change, we want to tackle poverty, injustice, we want to make the world a better place. Brilliant. We've also got to ask, why is it not the way it is? What is the power? So it's us, our responsibility to speak out, but that the reality is for all to have their potential and to act for the common good. So in order to do that, CAFL feels that local individuals, local communities, people like you, people like our partners, are all critical agents of change. And we're all, how can we be best placed to influence and bring about the changes to global, national and local policies so that they can benefit all? And I think that then takes us into the next step, which says this is about people speaking for themselves. This is about the right to self-determination of people who are poor and vulnerable and excluded. Has to be supported and empowered. It's their voices that we need to amplify, we need to stand alongside so that they're never ignored in favour of those with wealth or status. That is gospel. Jesus, who turned on its head the values and who are the rich and the powerful, whose voices are listened to. You know, the story of the Good Samaritan is not just about some bloke stopping. The hero of the Good Samaritan was the Samaritan. To the audience that was listening, the Good Samaritan was the most despised enemy of their time. It was like the Daily Mail having a headline going, asylum seeker is a really nice person. I mean, it was absolutely shocking. And we've sanitised that story quite a bit to turn it into the first bit, to turn it into giving food to the poor, not saying, actually, the heroes might be surprising, the voices need to be heard. And it's Jesus' mission and witness with women. Again, that's also part of it. The woman with the hemorrhage who was healed. So not only was she physically healed, she was socially healed. Because having a hemorrhage hemorrhaging in first century Palestine meant you were absolutely excluded because you were unclean if you were bleeding. So she was no longer just feeling better, she was brought back into community. And I'm reminded of the work that we do in the Democratic Republic of Congo with a place called Central Alame, which is absolutely amazing. And what they do is they have, for women and girls, and boys as well, unfortunately, but who are victims of sexual violence of the war, they are brought, they're listened to, their stories are heard, but their physical hurts are healed, but their emotional, their psychological, and their social hurts are also healed because the community is encouraged to hear their stories and to welcome them back. So that's integral ecology, the importance of the voice. Another plank for us is, which again builds on that, is creating a culture of encounter. So it's really important for us to recognise that it's through coming together that change happens. And that culture of encounter is there in Laudato Si, but it's particularly there in Fratelli Tutti, of the importance of just getting to know people, spending that time with people. International development organisations are often wonderful, but they often projectise people. And time again, our partners say to us, we get money, we get funding, but nobody cares about us as an organisation. And that's the difference that CAFL does, is if you imagine the polar mint, the mint with the hole in the middle, All around the outside, you've got all of these projects, and you're rich and you've got that money. But the inside, what keeps the organisation going, is never funded. There's never that support given to local organisations, and that's what we do as well. So that culture of encounter, how we work together, and recognising our shared vulnerability, and therefore for us it's about committing to relationships of mutual learning and shared development, to accepting others as equals and ensure those diverse voices are heard. Doing together, doing with, not doing to. And finally, our plank of our own ecological conversion. Pope Francis laid down that as a gauntlet. We have to try and model integral ecology. So that requires changes to us, the way we do things, as a community, as an organisation. Pope Francis asks us to have a radical conversion of the heart. How do we put it together? How do we not just become deeply aware of the suffering of people and planet, but also to discover what each of us can do about it? So we've brought in more sense of reflection and discernment across the organisation, trying to reflect on what's our understanding of progress, how we change ourselves. It's also very practical things, like reducing our own carbon footprints, flying less, which is a big challenge running an international organisation. And there's a lot there around, and also bringing it into the way in which we do our work through things like, we've got an environmental stewardship tool, we've got things like different sustainable business practices. We've come from Brasilia, places like in Central America, doing lots of work with indigenous communities on things like agroecology approach, those sorts of things.
It can't have been easy getting into those planks, the kind of process of analysing the capital as an organisation. Is there anything that you could draw out that might be useful for this movement? Well, Anne said yesterday that we're constantly reaching new beginnings. Are there any kind of learnings from the journey, I suppose?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a couple of excuse me. I think it is important to look at ourselves and our own organisation in our context. So we do a lot of analysis of the context, but then it's about looking at us. What is it that we're contributing to this? What difference can we make? And I'm sure you're the same as JP commissions or different organisations. You're reflecting on how you operate, how you respond to the issues of the day. And it's not about navel gazing. It's about helping us to sort of think, well, how can we do this better? What are the power dynamics? Who are our allies? Who are the people that who are the voices that we listen to? Who are the voices that we're not? What are our own, challenging ourselves in terms of our own ideological perspectives? And that's why things like this weekend is really important, to be able to kind of reflect together. But it is also about recognising, first of all, with hope, to recognise that we also have power. Paulo Freire's famous quote of, when the poor realise their power, only then can they realise their power, i.e. make it real. Actually recognising the power and the influence that we have is incredibly liberating. And sometimes it's a bit scary too. But it's about, so therefore, how do we use that? Where do we put that in? How do we make that happen? And we're faced with choices all the time. So, for instance, one of the things about kind of reaching the most vulnerable. I was in Kenya just the other year visiting some of our work, and it would be really easy for us to spend a lot of money in a stone's throw of an office in Nairobi. It would be we could do great work. It would be absolutely fantastic. Nobody would complain, but we don't. We're in Marsabit and Isiolo, which is the north bit, part of. Literally a 9-hour drive on the road, 2 hours off road. So it's literally, you do feel like, when is this going to end? But these are the most marginalised communities. They're pastoralist communities. They've been consistently, as the North always has been, consistently kind of done down by central government, excluded, and where they're with Caritas Marsabit. Caritas Marsabit, the church in that diocese, and their social development programme, we're supporting them. We're making an effort to go further. So they're the kind of choices that you make. Another example would be we have a thing called partner direct funding now, which is not easy, and we're moving towards it more and more. But traditionally, development organisations, apply for funds from all different places, and then it comes to us, and then we give it away. What we're also looking for is how can we support better those partner organisations that can apply directly for things like UN funding or other forms of institutional funding, and the money goes to them. So when I remember the first conversation with my trustees, who for a long time have been like, growth, capital has to be bigger, and they go, and the mum went, so this money doesn't come to us? No, it goes straight. It's a bit of a kind of shock to the system, but a really important lesson. Because actually, the money goes straight to partners, and we're investing in them. It's not us controlling it, it's not us doing it. So, but those kind of choices that we make about how we do things, quite key.
I think this partnership thing and listening to partners I find very interesting, and I suppose within the Caritas family there must be tensions. So the video we just watched, they were very progressive, and they're talking about the rights of nature. And I think a number of Catholics in this country would find it hard to talk about the rights of nature. So imagine across the Caritas family, you're all in different places on kind of political spectrums, on forms of engagement, and how you would approach injustice. How do you deal with those tensions? And how does that impact what you become as Catholic?
Well, I think the starting point is about our own authenticity. And I think this is perhaps a big lesson for all of us all the time, is really to have that authenticity and to think about how do we contribute to tackling the inequality in the world, and how do we contribute to sustaining inequality at the same time. They're two sides of the same coin. And what can we therefore do to shift the dial a little bit? And across the Caritas network, you're absolutely right, there are very different approaches and very different models. There is a lot of work going on under the heading of fraternal cooperation. I mean, I'd rather it was maternal cooperation, because I think that's a better model, but never mind, We'll deal with Vatican language another day. But I do think that there is an important message there around actually localisation is an important subsidiarity for the Catholic Church, recognising what can we do to make sure that people really have the empowerment that they need. And there are the voices are very strong. A colleague from Syria, when I was in Rome in May, was speaking about big organisations that come in and they don't even tell us where they're working, and they go, not Catholic. but there were people. I'm saying, well, there are people in this room. So how do you respond to this? Speaking to somebody else. And I think it's about having that dialogue. It's about being open to having those conversations. And I think, and in the church, we've got this synodal process going on, which is absolutely that culture of encounter, that ability to understand, put yourself in the shoes of other people, because to hear what they're saying, what their perspective, how does the world look to them, is going to be a challenge to us. And some, the things like the rights of nature, I think, is really exciting. So we have a conversation. Not you need to understand that nature has rights, but why does the rights of nature? What does that say to you? Is that frightening? Is that what are you worried about in relation to that? And it's those kind of conversations of engagement that I think are really vital. And I know many of you are engaged in the synodal process, and that sense of how the church provides that space for that culture of encounter is a really important thing to reflect on. And it's interesting, because I was at an event and his man was talking about the fact that he was reflecting on the fact that he does a lot of different things, football team and mates in the pub and all that kind of stuff, and he said, but actually, I've only just realised that the place where I experience the most diversity is my church. And yet, it hasn't really kind of sunk that, the world is in my church almost. And yet I'm not connecting with people in the way I should. So how can we use that synodal process to reach out? I mean, when I was in Liverpool JMP all those years ago, we had pastoral formation at the end of the corridor. And, and it was wonderful, but it was quite tense as well, because they had all the money and we had to kind of grovel, but also, I think part of it was I was a bit envious about the fact that they were working with parishes in the way we had to struggle to get into parishes. But what the synodal process is saying to us now is, actually, how can we work together as a church? So, and a lot of the sort of issues that we might have been sort of battling about, 30 years ago, are much more mainstream now. So, and we've got to see ourselves as part of formation. Preaching the gospel, the work for justice and for peace is a constituent element of preaching the gospel. I mean, I can't quite remember which bit that was, but it was in the 60s. It's an absolutely essential part of who we are. And so, in some respects, maybe if there are less justice and peace paid people, but maybe the point is that we need to be actually the formation. We need to be part of the formation people. We need to be making sure that we're bringing issues as part of an ongoing formation, not just a separate category, as it were. So I think within the global Caritas framework, I think there's something really important about recognising the diversity. There's unity and strength in diversity, about recognising that different people, different groups, different approaches work differently. To expect us to all to do the same, frankly, that's duplication. So what is it that we are doing in collaboration and complementing one another? And that's why you need to have that kind of analysis to say, well, what is it that we're bringing? And I often get it, well, why isn't CAFL working on X? Why isn't CAFL working on Y? Well, because you're working on X and you're working on Y. And do we all have to do the same? But, we try to support people, but it is about recognising that there's different ways of addressing different things. As long as we're talking to one another, as long as we're understanding that we're part of that garment, those threads that kind of weave together the most wonderful picture.
I think we've basically fallen off the script.
We have, totally.
This stuff around the encounter and the learning and listening, the bit that I'm not hearing that worries me and I'm sure is there is a kind of power analysis, and Catholic is the thunder. Or if we were to talk within the kind of social justice movement within the Catholic Church in the UK, Catholic is the biggest brand. He's a big fish there, and makes the culture in some way. So how do you kind of work with that? How do you so where does Catholic fit within the movement? What does it contribute to it? I think the answer is lots, but just kind of main that. How might that change? Particularly for me, looking at this depressing context at the moment. Like how bad things are getting, how bad do things have to get before Catholic moves even further to what I would call the radical? You like that question?
I think there's a fair amount of radicalism in Catholic. I mean, I think part of what trying to explain what our common strategy is to say actually we are a little bit different to how we might have been seen kind of years ago. And also, but actually, it is about us recapturing that sense of witness that I think we've always had, but perhaps being a bit stronger. I mean, the campaign on seeds that we're doing at the moment. I mean, it's interesting. 15 years ago, I was doing it in Progressio, and Catholic wasn't interested. But now, we're leading the way, which is great. And it's kind of, and I think there's also been a sense in which Catholics always been a little bit ahead of the curve as well in some instances. When I was the campaign coordinator of Catholic 30 years ago, it was on the Environment and Development campaign. We were the only development organisation that was even interested in environmental issues. So there's always going to be some levels where we're more radical, or some things where we're less radical. That's just to do with that power analysis. And I think we are doing all the time that sense of, so what can we contribute? How can we work on this? I think we are quite what I'd call movement generous organisation. There's been a lot of collaboration and partnership with the Justice and Peace, and we very much see ourselves as part of the church here in Wales. We're part of the family. And I know that we can be a slightly big and lumbering organisation, but actually I think there's a huge amount of generosity in place. I'd be interested in kind of what does it mean to be more radical? Because I think we are talking about trying to dare to be different. We're talking about a level of inequality. We're talking about structural justice. 2025, the Jubilee year, having conversations about debt, making sure that there's trying to encourage a bigger campaign, not just from Catholics but across the Caritas network, pushing. There's conversations with the dicastery around that as well. So debt is a big issue for us, looking at as part of that Jubilee year. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we're doing that's radical. We are as well, we're the agency of the Bishops' Conference, where there'll be quiet conversations that we'll have. Some of this is tactics. You don't necessarily always, not always kind of like sitting on the barricades. And sometimes you have to think, am I about making noise or am I about making an impact? And sometimes, as we heard on that video, doing things quietly and doing things not in a big public hoo-ha can have a much bigger impact.
And I'd agree that you are very movement generous. And just as a little experiment, in the room, if you've had any formation from CAFOD, would you just raise your hand if that's been part of any of your story? And I think that says something. So yeah, and actually, just as a personal one, during COVID, the children's liturgy, that was fantastic for keeping my family at church. So thank you.
And also, I think the other thing for us is that one of the biggest things that was our downloads in not just in COVID but generally is our prayer and worship resources. And to be honest, that's also incredibly powerful. That's what makes us not just an NGO. We are the body of Christ here. We're trying to put our faith into practice, and that's an element of it too.
So maybe I'm going to ask you to kind of expand what you mean by we here, because we as CAFOD and then we as church in the UK. And so Laudato Si is already 8 years old. Lots of in some ways it needs an update. How to phrase this? What sort of successes and challenges have there been in getting that environmental spirituality, getting that kind of theology, a theology of action perhaps into the actual churches, into the schools, to Catholic young people, into the seminaries? Where do you think CAFOD has played a role there that's been successful? Where are the challenges? And maybe another challenging question is, well, what can we do to help CAFOD? So I think I often come in with, I want CAFOD to do this, I want CAFOD to do that, because I see this and nobody else has the capacity. But what can the movement do to support CAFOD? Lots of those questions. Pick some of them.
But I think I'd want to start by saying, it's not just CAFOD. The Laudato Si movement who are here, we're very much respectful of our role within the Laudato Si movement and more generally. I think there is something really important for us about. Yes, we do. We all have to do what we can. So please, thank you for the support that you give to CAFOD, and thank you for the engagement that you do, because that does feed in hugely to achieving change. When I meet with ministers, and I'm not just round the table because because of how much money goes through our books. I'm there because I'm the voice of the Catholic Church, and and politicians do know that. We're going to do some more about that this afternoon. But churches are incredibly active. We're going to have an interesting 2 years ahead of us, she says, trying not to be political. But the reality is that church is going to be really active on hustings, on posing questions. We're working with the SVP on the election sort of work. So I think it's about making sure that the voices of the Catholic community are out there talking about the wide range of issues. Talking about all issues around human dignity, around our economy, around our place in the world. And I think the one thing that politicians do say to me is, well, people aren't saying this. No one's telling me this on the doorstep. So do keep telling them, do keep writing those letters, do keep, making themselves annoying, because that matters. Because when you stop telling them, they don't listen. And when you do tell them, so we got a letter quite recently from Andrew Mitchell, who's the Minister for Development, who basically said, could you please put this reply on your website, because we're having so many letters, and it's like, so, but what that did to us, and Andrea can explain a bit more later, but what we were able to do then is to take their letter and to continue with that dialogue. But that was a dialogue that was created because of all of your efforts in writing to your MPs. Otherwise, they just don't take any notice. So it's really important to have your voices heard, really important to do that. And CAFOD, I think, it's joining alongside others in being able to kind of help take that forward. So I think there's some of the lessons from that are around, don't lose hope that your voice isn't effective. It really is. You don't necessarily hear that back, and perhaps we can be better at some of that feedback, but it does make a difference. And I think it's also because it is a different voice. There is something about, well, we expect Catholics to write to us about abortion or something, but actually having Catholics writing to us about the reality of the world is really important. And I also think it's not just about because you're writing, it's because churches are active. How many churches here are doing food distribution, are doing advice, and reaching out. My parish does food distribution, supports a refugee family, all sorts of stuff. Churches are doing this stuff. So it's the authenticity behind our voice. CAFOD doesn't just speak because it feels up to it. It speaks because we've got a raft of work, because of partners. It's the same with yourselves. When the church across the world is engaged, it is fundamentally the biggest. CAFOD, as part of Caritas, it's the second biggest as a development organisation, only to the Red Cross. So it's operated at a very kind of divided level, but it's huge capacity, and I think people have to understand and acknowledge that.
Is there anything else that you would like to say before I ask people to have a little conversation amongst themselves? Is there anything that I'm going to wish that you had the chance to say because we fell off the script?
Right, I'm just going to say, what did I want to say? I wanted to talk about authenticity and how each of us contributes. I think that's right. I think there's something about that encounter, listening to one another, put yourself in your feet, absolutely vital. I think it's also for us, I think I've talked about the voice agency and leadership of local people, and about being able to do that, to be able to give that space. So for instance, in the COP negotiations in Sharm last year, the CAFOD delegation was all partners. Caritas Bangladesh, Caritas Africa, the two CAFOD staff were there in the support role on policy and on technical social media support. It's about giving that voice, it's about giving that, and again, that's the choice. I was talking to a chief exec who said, "Oh, you're going to COP, you're going to COP." He wrote in an envelope, this guy. But it was like, "Are you going?" And going, "No, I'm not going. Why would I be going?" Because it's our colleagues from Caritas Bangladesh or Caritas Africa that actually, who people need to hear. And they were so busy, weren't they? They were just like going from one meeting to the next, having their voices heard. I've never felt so proud. That's what it's all about. I think the other thing is that you talked about the CAFOD journey. Making changes ourselves is not always easy. Sometimes it feels like it's a tanker, but it really matters. We're going through a process now to just sort of reflect on what have the last 3 years meant to us in this new strategy, and there's an energy, there's an excitement. People across CAFOD talk about our common home. We talk about it. And that means a lot to me, because it's not just a strategy, it's not just a document that's on the shelf, it's being lived out. And if that strategy is being lived out, then our faith is being lived out, our witness is happening. So I think that authenticity really, really strikes me as really critical. And I just want to say, just before we go into a bit of chat, I think the hope that Brian talked about last night is absolutely critical. You know, we are people of hope. You know, and all around the world, and in our own communities too, we see such a lot of depression. We see such a lot of, you know, people who are facing such horrors of death and destruction, poverty, of inequality, of exclusion. And you know, I'm reminded of Oscar Romero's famous quote about, "Well, my blood may be spilt, but my spirit lives on in the people." It's finding that spirit that we live on. How true is that? And you know, we face. My inbox is pretty depressive in terms of the situational updates that I get from all around the world. You know, and there's often times when I kind of go to bed thinking, you know, feeling the responsibility for colleagues in Sudan or, you know, all around the world, and just the sheer feeling humbled by the people in Mosulbek who are on absolutely at that front line, and feeling grateful that we're trying to shift the dial just that little bit. So there's something here about finding our hope, finding and seeing and being conscious of the Holy Spirit keeping us going, working with us. Because like that day in Pentecost, the disciples were locked in a room frightened. How many times do we feel like we just want to lock ourselves in a room and feel frightened? But then the Spirit, Jesus came in, the Spirit came amongst them, and they were fired up, ready to go. And that's I think, part of it. And the SDGs provide us with a framework. Our Data C provides us with nourishment. Our social teaching provides us with that fuel to keep us going. The water in our own wells, as Gustavo Gutierrez used to describe it as. And that's what we need to have, that depth. And we get it from one another, we get it from our relationships, we get it from our encounters, we get it from feeding the Spirit in one another.
Thank you, Christine, for all your insights and wisdom. What we're going to do now is have just a minute or two talking to people around you. The aim is to work out, what are you taking away from this morning? What are you taking into the rest of this weekend and the process that Anne described last night? What are you taking into back to your parishes, back to your work? So we have only 5 minutes. Can I have 10 minutes? Where's Anne? Anne, can we have 10 minutes? Nobody said no. Right. Coffee is there's a 5 minute gap in the timetable. No one knows what it is. We're having it. So you have 2 minutes to talk to each other. What are you taking away from this morning's conversation? Everybody, what we're going to do is ask for some comments from the floor, and the roving mics are going to rove. Please could you not speak until the microphone reaches you, and please could you very briefly introduce yourselves. And there will be time for, let's say, something like 4 comments, and some of them might be questions. You know this, I won't be able to resist questions. And you will have only about a minute or 2 to respond, because we need to be out of here by 1:45. Okay? So if you would like a roving mic to appear, please put your hand up. There's one at the back, one there, Alex on the front.
My name is Eric Pierce. I want to, in terms of the radical nature of CAFOD, I wonder whether the Live Simply program might be somewhat radicalized, particularly in relation to the whole issue of dieting and fasting, going slightly beyond fasting on having fish on Fridays.
Thank you. And over there, I think.
Christine, thank you very much. This is Anita. How are you? Christine, we talk very much about acting as a model of an integral ecology. And Brian last night asked us to sign up to the Data Action Plan. I just wondered how many CAFOD employees are signing up to Data Action Plan? And what are they doing at parish level to support social development? And how is CAFOD supporting circular economy and recycling projects within the UK?
Well done, you got lots of questions into one, and that was very impressive. And I saw a hand here.
Mary Woodward from Caritas Westminster. Hi. Lots of great things. A lot of things that we've heard before, but really good to be reminded of the language. I haven't heard movement generous before, so I love that. And authenticity is something that's come up, but not something I've actually been using, so I've put that in bold in my notes to use more. One of the things I didn't hear, and I think, but it links a lot to what you said, is very much is using the opportunity of that diversity of parishes. But yes, you talked about listening and encounter and the authenticity, the witness, evidencing and amplifying voices, and all that will come through the synodal process, we hope, and we will support and make sure it does. But the other thing is the framing, and actually helping people in the parishes, that diversity, to thinking about those that are more privileged, maybe, to help them to understand that the way that they've been taught to about things, about the way of the world, is actually one perspective and not necessarily right. So the perspective that we learn from our politicians and from journalists in mass media is not necessarily the right way of thinking about things. And yes, we can learn that ourselves slowly through listening and encounter and through witness, but actually maybe CAFOD and Caritas and Justice and Peace can help us to frame things in a more a better way with regards to Justice and Peace.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to stop there because you have 2 minutes to comment on some of what you have just heard. And you've got to allow at least 30 seconds for applause, so yeah.
Whooping. Live Simply, Liam's our Live Simply coordinator, so very happy to reflect on different ways. I mean, I think part of the point of Live Simply, which is an amazing programme, it's been running for 10 years now, and so we're in the process of kind of like reflecting on it, so that's really great. And offering different choices, because I think, as Marion said, there's not just one perspective, there's not just one right answer here. There are lots of different perspectives, and so it's important to be able to offer those choices to people. I think that framing point is absolutely right, that it's got to be about dialogue. I think what I'm experiencing in our current political life is just horrendous language and you know, the institutionalization of self-righteous. Anyway, I'm not going to say any words because someone will quote me. But it's just xenophobic racism, frankly, and it absolutely, we need to understand that we are one humanity and remember our humanity. So I think there's always work to be done around framing. And Anita, there's lots of stuff that CAFOD both does. Both as an organisation and individuals, there's lots of activities that people are doing. There's a huge amount right across CAFOD, and one of the things that I'm always criticised for is that we never, you know, that we're not doing this, we're not doing that. You know, I mean, we have an amazingly committed, engaged, talented staff who constantly keep me on my toes to make sure that we're pushing and going further. So there's lots going on. The extent to which we can always actively and support things going on in different parishes is questionable, isn't it? Because there's only so many hours in the day, and we've got a remit and stuff like that. So yes, I think I'm going to end almost where I began, with that manifesto from the prophet Micah, because that is what our God asks of us, to have a holistic, integrated approach with God and our relationships at the centre, that we act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly together as well as with God. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.